Hi there. My name is Cameron Guerrero. I'm the visual caption head for the Blue Devils B Drum and Bugle Corps and the director of bands and orchestras at Granada Hills Charter High School in Southern California. Today we're going to talk a little bit about some basics of reading a football field as it pertains to the marching band activity, as well as some basics of reading coordinate sheets and dot sheets, just so you can be more successful while you're on the field with whatever organization you're a part of. I want to start by giving a bit of a disclaimer that some of what I say today might not necessarily vibe with what your band director or what your visual caption head talks about on a regular basis with your ensemble. A lot of what I talk about is very specific to BDB, and that's okay if it's a little bit different than what you're used to. Just know that while you're with another ensemble, whatever your director or visual caption head says should be the top priority. But hopefully what I say can help you to be a little bit more informed as to how to read a field and how to apply yourself to that information a little further. Let's get started today by talking a little bit about the parts and dimensions of a football field as we know it. In this diagram to my left, you can see from end zone to end zone that the football field is 100 yards wide. That doesn't include those end zones on either side, and if you were to add those to the total width, that puts you at 120 yards, because each of those end zones is 10 yards deep. We don't use those on a regular basis, but that is good information to know. As you look even further at this diagram, you can see that the field is separated vertically by a bunch of yard lines. Those occur every 5 yards, and usually every 10 yards, there's numbers down at either sideline that help you to keep track of which yard line you're on. We can also see that right on the sidelines, there's a bunch of little tick marks. Those divide each 5-yard segment further into 1-yard segment. As we go from the front of the field to the back of the field, you can see that there's sidelines on either side. The bottom of the image would be the front sideline where the drum major or the front ensemble is set up. As you go back field, you'll hit the front hash. Behind that is the back hash, and then all the way at the back is the back sideline. If we were to divide the field into two parts, let's say side 1 and side 2, from your perspective, side 1 is going to be on the left, side 2 is going to be on the right. This is on either side of the 50. However, if you're standing on the field, that's going to switch those for you. So on your left side, as you're facing front field, would be side 2, and on your right side would be side 1. That can get a little bit confusing, and oftentimes when somebody misreads their drill sheet, that's what they're doing incorrectly. So make sure that you get that set in your head so you know that side 2 as a performer is on your left, side 1 is on your right. Furthermore, let's talk just a little bit about how we divide the field from front to back. We do have what we call GACs. We divide the field by 4 steps, and that helps us to grid the field into smaller chunks so that we can be a little bit more accurate moving forward. But we will talk about those further and what they mean here in just a second. Moving right along, let's talk about some of the markings on the football field and specifically how they pertain to us. So let's get a football field up on the screen, and there we go. Thank you, Video Magic. So let's talk a little bit about parts of these field, specifically as they pertain to us as marching band performers. We can see that there are numbers all the way across. We can see that this field that we're talking about right now doesn't go behind the front hash. That's what these lines are up here at the top. So theoretically, there should be a whole rest of the field back in this area. And then also there should be more field outside the 25s, but our screen just isn't big enough for that today, so we don't need to talk about that a whole lot. You'll notice that we have our tick marks right here on the front of the field that notate our 1-yard increments. You'll notice that we have our yard lines every 5 yards, and you'll notice that we have GACs in blue right here going between the front hash and the front sideline. Before we go on, as a reference point, let's draw a little drum major right here on the 50 front field. There we go. So we know that that's where the front sideline is. Cool. So let's talk a little bit further about what our step size is and how we grid the field, meaning how we really turn the field into a graph that we then mark ourselves on. We use what's called an 8-to-5 step size to mark the field. 8-to-5, if you don't know what that is already, is really just kind of the standard step size in the marching band activity. The 8-to-5 step size comes from dividing each 5-yard increment between yard lines into 8 steps. So if you extrapolate that a little bit further, that means that every 4 steps, you're exactly in between yard lines. We can use these ticks on the front of the field to help us figure out when we're exactly in between each yard line. So you'll notice there's 4 tick marks. So if we were to divide that in half, we'd be right in between the center 2 ticks, and then we'd be exactly in the center of those 2 yard lines. That 8 to 5 step size also helps us to inform where these GACs go from the front of the field to the back of the field. Each GAC counts for 4 steps from front to back. So essentially what that means is that if you're standing on the first GAC back from the front sideline, you're exactly the same amount of room from the sideline that you would be if you were standing in between the 2 yard lines. So that's exactly 4 steps. And now for some real-world applications for that. Let's pretend like we have a specific drill set that we have written, and we're trying to figure out where that's going to be. So for example, let's say that we're on the side 2 45-yard line. And let's say that we're 8 steps behind the front sideline. Cool. So it's a lot of information if we look at it right off the bat. So let's break it down into smaller parts. I think the easiest way to think about it is really just like graphing like you would in your math class. We have our x-coordinate and we have our y-coordinate, and we just need to figure out how that fits on the graph. So let's start with the x-coordinate, because that is normally where we start when we're graphing something in our math class. That would be side to side, so over here, the on-side 2 45-yard line. So let's remember, right now, you are from a director's point of view, meaning side 1 is on your left-hand side, side 2 is on your right-hand side. That would be switched for you as a performer from that different perspective, but right now you're from a director's perspective. So side 2 is going to be on our right-hand side over here on this side of the 50-yard line. So we know that we're already narrowed down to this side of the field. Second thing is we need to find the 45-yard line. Using these numbers onto the front of the field, we can see that the 45 on this half of the field is going to be right here. So this is the 45-yard line, and it says on side 2 45, so we know that we're standing on that yard line. Cool. So now we have our x-coordinate. Let's find our y-coordinate. And that would be 8 steps behind the front sideline. So first step is identify the front sideline. That's this line right up here. And then we're 8 steps behind that. So we know that the GACs stand for 4 steps, and we're 8 steps back. So that's 2 GACs, 1, 2, on the 45-yard line. So that is our first coordinate right there. Congratulations, you found your first dot. So let's continue with a little bit more of a difficult coordinate, or at least more involved, if not more difficult. Cool. Let's say 2 steps inside the side 140, and let's say 6 steps in front of the front hash. FH stands for front hash in this situation. So we'll break it down into x and y coordinates again. Our x-coordinate says we're 2 steps inside the side 140-yard line. Cool. So step 1 is always figure out which side of the field you're on. This talks about side 1. We know that that's over here on this side of the field, the side 1 40-yard line. We can find the 40-yard line pretty easily because we have the big old 40 staring at us right in the face. So we know that we're on this yard line on side 1. Now we see 2 steps inside. Inside and outside are words that we use to help us decide which side of a yard line we're standing on. Inside always pertains to closer to the 50-yard line. Outside always pertains to outside, or further away, I'm sorry, from the 50-yard line. So when we talk about 2 steps inside, that means 2 steps on the 50-yard line side of that yard line. So here's the 40, side 140. 2 steps inside means 2 steps towards the 50. So we're going to go 1, 2 steps inside the 40. Cool. So we know that somewhere along this plane is where we're going to be standing. Now we just need to find our y-coordinate, which is 6 steps in front of the front hash. So we know that our front hash is right here. We need to find 6 steps in front of that. We know that GACs represent 4 steps, so we're going to go 1.5 GACs forward, 4 steps, 5, 6 steps. Cool. So we're already 6 steps in front of the hash, and then we need to find 2 steps inside the 40, which if splitting is right here, that's 4 steps. 2 steps would be right about here. So that is where our second coordinate would be. Let's talk through that again one more time just to make sure we're clear. Side 140 and 2 steps inside, meaning 2 steps towards the 50. 1, 2, and then 6 steps in front of the front hash, in front meaning towards the front sideline, 4 steps and 6 steps, and there we go. Now let's move forward into a little bit even more specific, maybe with a decimal in there. Cool. Let's say 4 steps outside side 140 and 3.5 steps behind front sideline. Cool. So breaking it up into x and y coordinates once again, our x coordinate says we're 4 steps outside the side 140. So the side 140 we know is on this side of the screen, and it's the one with the big 40 on it. 4 steps outside, meaning away from the 50. So 4 steps away from that 40 is going to be right here. We also know that 4 steps should be right in between yard lines. So not only are you 4 steps outside the side 140, you're also 4 steps inside the side 135. That's really the same thing. So we know we're going to be on this plane right in between the 35 and the 40. And then using our y coordinate, we're 3.5 steps behind the front sideline. So we know that these gacs, again, are 4 steps. So we're going to be about half a step in front of that, which really is just right about there. Half a step is not that far, and we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of step size here in a moment. So there we go. We have our first 3 coordinates just like that. Let's go ahead and transition a little bit into spacing and how to read those little tick marks on the front of the field. We get this a little bit more cleaned up, since we don't need the whole field anymore. You know what, let me use a little bit of that TV magic really quick. This is done. And there we go again. There's a little microcosm of the field in front of us that we can really get down into detail about how to read the field. As you can see, we have two sets of 5 yards, 3 yard lines. It doesn't really matter what they are, but we'll just say, we'll say 35, 40, and 45. You can also see that we have 2 sets of gacs here, just the front 2. So really, we have 16 steps wide by 8 steps tall, because we have 2 sets of yard lines, each with 8 steps in between at an 8 to 5, and we have 2 gacs, each representing 4 steps at an 8 to 5. So let's really understand how that 8 to 5 step size works within the confines of our football field grid. First thing we need to look at is let's go side to side. So we know for a fact that at 4 steps, right here, we are exactly in between the 2 yard lines. Cool. We also know that at 2s, we should be exactly in between on either side of that 4. And then at 3s, let's use blue. At 3s, we're going to be in between those. And 1s, we're going to be in between those. Great. So now we have 8 even-sized steps. And now let's relate them a little bit to these ticks on the front of the field. So splitting, the pink mark right here in the middle, 4 steps, is always going to be directly in between these 2 ticks on the front of the field. Right there. If you're lucky, if you're on a nice field, these ticks will also be next to the hash marks, both the front and back hashes, so you can be specific there too. So again, splitting should be right in between those 2 center tick marks. 2s are going to be just a little bit, sorry, I did 2s in orange. 2s are going to be just a little bit outside of the tick marks closest to the yard lines. So 2s are going to be right about there. When you, in practice, are at a 2 away from your yard line, especially if you're standing on those tick marks, the foot that's closest to the yard line, that pinky toe, is going to be right on this tick mark, either there. So if I'm standing right here, facing the front of the field, which is here, my left pinky toe would be right on that tick mark, and that's how I find a two-step interval. On the right side over here, or I guess right side if you're facing the front sideline, my right pinky toe would be right on that tick mark facing the front of the field. And then let's talk a little bit about threes. For threes, I'm going to be even closer to that inner tick mark, right there or so. And with those, the athletic platform or the ball of your foot is going to be on the tick mark. So if I'm standing here facing the front of the field at a three-step interval, the ball of my right foot is going to be on that tick mark. Not the pinky toe, but the ball of my right foot. At this dot, 3 away from the 35, my left foot, the ball of my left foot is going to be right there on the tick mark. Cool? So again, for two-step intervals, remember that your pinky toe is just barely touching that little tick mark. And then for three-step intervals, the ball of your foot is going to be on the tick mark. For splitting, you're going to be directly in between. Cool. So all of those things can help us with checkpoints as we find our space right here in between. And then with these GACs, really the best thing to do is just make sure that you're dividing it equally in your brain. Usually those are laid down with either paint or with masking tape, depending on what kind of field you're on. But just know that those are very rarely, if ever, on performance fields. So you're not going to get to use those at performances, but they're good for finding your dot in drill. Very good. So now let's talk about some interval training. And I'm not talking about sprints and then walking and then sprints and then walking. I'm talking about intervals from performer to performer. So let's imagine for a moment that we have 5 performers at two-step intervals. Cool. We have 5 people to place at two-step intervals, and let's say they have to be here 8 back from the sideline. And then we'll use little stars to indicate people. Star equals person. Cool. So we have 5 people. Let's evenly space the first 3. That should be easy. So we have one standing right here, 8 back and on the yard line. We have another here, 8 back and on the other yard line. Cool, so there's 2. 2 are done. 2, 3, 4, 5, and we have these 2 marked off. So we have 3 more that we have to space evenly. The third we can put directly in between, right? We have 3 left, so that one can go right in between those tick marks, right in the middle, right there, and those are going to be evenly spaced as well. Great. So now we have 3. Those are evenly spaced, and we have to put 2 more in there to make it a two-step interval. So using what we just learned about two-step spacing, especially when you're 2 away from a yard line, if we put this star's right pinky toe on this tick mark, that'll make them exactly in between. That gives us 4. And then the 5th one, we'll put their left pinky toe right on that tick mark. And that'll give them evenly spacing as well. Cool. So the best thing to remember is with those 2s and 3s in particular, with 2s, your pinky toe is going to be touching a tick mark. With 3s, the ball of your foot is going to be touching a tick mark. And if you do that effectively, that really should help to keep everything nice and even. Let's talk about those 3s really quick. Let's say we're at a 3-step interval. So from this star to our next star, our 3-step star, the ball of this star's right foot would be on the tick mark right about there. Another 3 steps would be at a 2, so the pinky toe of this star's right foot would be on, and then 1-step interval over here, we kind of just eyeball. It's right in between 2 and the yard line. And then the very last thing we'll talk about in terms of spacing and how to read these ticks is exactly how many steps each of these tick marks are. So the tick marks are exactly 1.6 steps from tick to tick. So if we go from the 40-yard line to the first tick, we're taking 1.6 steps at an 8 to 5. If we go from the 40-yard line to the second tick, that's exactly 3.2 steps. And then another 1.6 steps would be 4.8, and so on and so forth. 5.4 if you're, or I'm sorry, 6.4 if you're having a hard time with that math. Apparently I am. Cool. So that's a good thing to remember too. So if you ever need to find 1.5 steps, you know that you're just barely on the inside of that tick mark close to the yard line, and that should help a little bit too. Let's do a little bit more TV magic, and then we'll move on with our discussion. Much better. Okay, the very last thing I want to talk about is how we interpret our spacing on the field. At the Blue Devils, we talk a lot about making sure that we are checking our checkpoints using our ankle bones. We don't try to line up our shoulders when we're dressing a form as we march or anything. We always use the ankle bone. The reason for that is with performers of all kinds, meaning brass performers, percussion performers, color guard performers, whatever it is who's on the field, it's much, much easier just for us to look down at the ground and line up our ankle bones than it is for us to try and line up our different body shapes using our shoulders. So anytime we line up on the field, we always make sure that our ankle bones are right on top of our dot. And that really just helps us to be a lot more successful with lining up on the field. We also use a thing called focalization when we're dressing big curves. What focalizing means is turning into the curve, meaning into the focal point of the curve or the center of the curve, and holding our arms out to make sure that that curve is nice and smooth. Using dots when dressing curved forms can be really, really tricky, even if you're exactly on what your dot is. So what helps us a lot is doing that focalization technique so that we can really, really look down the curve and see that it's nice and smooth exactly how we'd like it to be. And with that, we're at the conclusion of our video today. I hope that we've helped you to learn a little bit more about the football field as it pertains to marching band, how to read a coordinate sheet, and how to place a dot on a football field. I want to leave you with one more thought before we go, and that's that there's always another layer of dirt to take off of your drill. Never stop looking for new ways to clean your own drill or your own pathways to make sure that you're performing at the best of your ability. Thanks a lot. Have a good one.